In ancient Rome, women were the property of the father at first. Then they become the husband's property. But what if you are not satisfied with that at all? Like our protagonist, Tuccia. In ancient Rome, it was already customary to educate girls too. So, she studied with her younger brother. From early childhood, she was outraged by the difference in the man and women position in society that she saw every day. Her brother would manage his own life and property, and she would become something like a thing. She was only 11, and in a year they would look for a husband for her. But could she change it? She had no choice to marry or not to marry. According to the rules, all free-born women had to marry, and that's that. No unmarried aunts. And there wasn't much freedom in choosing a husband. For the rich and powerful, marriage often was a chance to seal political, social, or financial alliances. However, it wasn't easier for the peasants either. But one day she saw them in a dream. They were special women. The Romans literally worshipped and revered them. Their cult lasted 1,000 years. It was believed that they had magical abilities. Plutarch wrote that they also kept divine secrets hidden from everyone. Their word was law for everyone, including rulers. They owned insanely expensive property. They had places of honor in the theater and circus, and even meet them on the street could save any criminal from execution. Their name was Vestal virgins. Yes, young girls of ancient Rome could only get unprecedented power and privileges for women in one case. They had to become priestesses of Vestal, the goddess of the hearth. For that, they swore to serve the deity for 30 years and remained chaste all this time. A man seeking the love of a Vestal had to die. But let's go back to our Tuccia. One of the Vestals in her dream extended a hand and said, "You are one of us." When she woke up, she immediately told her parents about her dream. In the afternoon, they learned that one of the Vestals died last night, and now they would choose a new one. The creation of the Vestals Institute is attributed to the legendary king Numa Pompilius, who ruled after Romulus, the founder of Rome, from about 715 to 673 before Christ. Although the divine priestesses themselves seem to be much older, because according to legend, the first Vestal was the mother of Romulus and Remus, who gave birth to them from the god of war Mars. The twins were abandoned on the bank of the river and were fed, as you remember, by a wolf. And after the birth of the twins, their Vestal mother was thrown into the Tiber by her own father for breaking the celibacy vow. But Rhea Silvia was saved by the god of the river, Tiberine, and became his wife. It seems that the first Vestal was not just a woman, but the embodiment of a deity. The Vestals were not just priestesses. They were responsible for the well-being of Rome. They kept the sacred fire. There were initially 4 priestesses of Vestal. Then their number was increased to 6. The father of our protagonist reported about an unusual dream of his daughter in the night of the virgin priestess's death. The girl was brought to the main Vestal, to her chambers. Ruins of the Vestal's house still exist in Rome. It was located next to the Temple of Vesta, at the foot of the Palatine, near the Forum. It looked like an aristocratic residence, or a domus, but a huge one. Around the open courtyard atrium with swimming pools, there were extensive chambers of 6 Vestals, a large and luxurious reception hall, ceremonial rooms, a refectory, rooms for servants and slaves. There was a sacred grove of Vesta nearby, where a wonderful voice, later called the god Eye, warned the Romans about the upcoming trials before the terrible invasion of the Gauls. On the way, Tuccia admired the beauty of the Vestal home and felt real awe before meeting the greatest Vestal herself. Usually, a new place among the Immaculate Virgins of Fire was vacated when the term of one of the Vestals expired, 30 years. In this case, the new priestess had to be indicated by a lot. The will of the gods indicated which of the 20 candidates was worthy to become Vestal. The following requirements were imposed on potential priestesses: age from 6 to 10 years, no physical disabilities. Initially, the applicants were chosen only from the daughters of patricians, noble Romans, then from plebeians as well. The main thing was that the girls came from families of free citizens of Rome. A prerequisite was the health of both parents. Our protagonist met all the conditions except one: she was already 12. But the situation was also extraordinary. In case of the deaf Vestal, the candidates were selected by the main Vestal, and they could be older than 10. There were cases when even young widows became Vestals. The main Vestal asked our protagonist in detail about her dream, and said that she had seen the deceased priestess of Vesta in her dream. She allowed Tuccia to draw lots, and she was chosen by the gods. She got the lot. During the solemn ceremony of selecting a Vestal, the pontiff pointed to Tuccia and took her away from her parents with the words, "I take you, a mother, to make you a priestess of Vesta, and perform the sacred rites that, according to the law, a Vestal must perform on behalf of the Roman people, on the same conditions as the one who was a Vestal." When Tuccia entered the temple of Vesta, her hair was cut off. Since then, our protagonist wore white clothes that distinguished Vestals from other Roman women. It was exactly the opposite of future Christian nuns' vestments. The priestesses of Vesta were wrapped up to their feet in a white cloth, polo. A rope was tied around the Vestal's waist. A special veil was put on the head. But what did the mysterious Vestals do? What would she do now? For the first 10 years, our protagonist, like other young Vestals, was initiated and told by senior priestesses. And only after 10 years she herself became a priestess of Vesta. For the last 10 years she had to become a mentor. The most important duty of Vestal virgins was to maintain the sacred fire on the altar of Vesta. The flame was extinguished only once a year, on the first day of the new year, March the 1st. Then it was relit in the most ancient way, by rubbing wood against wood. From this sacred fire, anyone could get a fire for their hearth. The Vestals who allowed the sacred fire to die down were guilty of disasters threatening the eternal city, because that meant the protection of the goddess was removed from the city. The Vestal guilty of extinguishing the fire was punished with rods in a dark room behind a curtain to observe modesty. No man could enter the temple. This was also punishable by death. The priestesses collected water from the sacred spring to wash the temple, kept some sacred objects, the exact list is unfortunately unknown. They participated in various rites, including Vestalius. The safety of the Vestal virgins and everything entrusted to their care was considered extremely important to the Roman people. Bodily injuries to Vestals were punished by death. The Vestals were the only women in Roman society beyond male control, whether it was a father or a husband. The virgin priestesses of fire were extremely rich. They owned huge estates that gave a large income. Each Vestal at the initiation received a decent amount from her family. Emperors also lavished priestesses with gifts. When the Vestal Cornelia joined the priestesses in the year 24, Emperor Tiberius gave her 2 million sesterces. At the same time, the virgins of the sacred fire were not nuns in the usual sense. They wasn't isolated from the world. Vestals were necessarily invited to numerous public ceremonies. Priestesses of Vesta had places of honor, gladiatorial fights, and performances. The consul himself gave way to the Vestals when they met. They had the right to move around Rome in a carriage. Almost no one might do that. The protection of the sacred virgins was a matter of security. They were accompanied by an armed bodyguard, a lictor. And a convicted criminal who was being led to execution get a pardon if he accidentally met a Vestal on the way. They could free prisoners and slaves by touching them. In such a masculine world, these women interfered in politics actively. The Vestals didn't hesitate to use their huge privileges for the purposes of their family. They did it rudely, and no one dared to protest. Vestals testified without the usual oath. Their word was trusted without question. Priestesses were considered incorruptible and guarded the wills of statesmen and important state documents. Don't you think that everything is too smooth? What did the virgins have to sacrifice? Here we turn to the most famous and sinister part of the cult of Vesta. A terrible fate awaited the Vestal who dared to fall in love. After the initiation, the girls took an oath that they would serve Vesta for 30 years and remain virgins all this time. Only ritual purity, including sexual purity, allowed the priestesses to deal with the sacred fire of Vesta and other sacred objects. Any violation of the ritual was fraught with a violation of the fragile balance between the human world and the God's world. The loss of a Vestal virginity was considered a state crime, more terrible than the fact that the sacred fire died out. Ancient authors described such cases as a national disaster. After all, the fate of the Roman state depended on that. The punishment was severe. Since it was strictly forbidden to shed the blood of a Vestal, a condemned woman was buried alive in the cursed field at the Colon Gate. According to Plinius, that was the most terrible sight for the city and the saddest day. The condemned woman in a shroud was carried through the entire forum. She was accompanied by relatives, priests, and ordinary citizens. Then the unfortunate woman went down to the dungeon. There was a bed, a lamp, and a small supply of food and water, not to offend Vesta, because ordinary people starved her priestess, who kept the sacred secrets of goddess. After that, the entrance to the dungeon was blocked. A severe execution was also prescribed for the priestess's lover. He was publicly beaten to death with willow rods in the forum ballroom or in the comitium. However, during the entire 1,000-year history of the Vestal's cult, only 10 women were convicted for dishonor. Here is how the ancient Roman historian Titus Livius described one of these cases. General anxiety and terrible heavenly signs, which happen almost daily in the city and the neighborhoods, soothsayers telling the future by animal insights and bird flight, announced to the state and private individuals that the only reason for such God's concern was a violation of sacred rites. These fears were resolved by the fact that the Vestal Opia was convicted for lust and executed. According to historians, the poor Vestals were made scapegoats. Many of these trials took place during state crises, and it was necessary to find guilty. But not always, however. The Vestal Florona had an affair with a scribe and fell in love. The Vestal Minucia was accused because of her excessive love to dresses and the testimony of a slave. She was found guilty of not keeping her chastity and was buried alive. Similarly, another Vestal Postumia was under suspicion because of her immodest outfits, but she only got a strict warning that she had lived fun, ridicule, gaiety, and self-conceit. The one who would lose her innocence against her will had a sad fate as well, despite the immunity that had happened before. So, a real monster, the Emperor Nero, raped the Vestal Rubra. Another Vestal, Julia Aquilia Severa, was stolen from the sanctuary by the Emperor Heliogabalus, who became famous for his orgies and his marriages to 5 women and 2 men. Heliogabalus forced the Vestal to marry him. Of course, according to Roman law, this was a real blasphemy. But the emperor declared that the marriage of a priest to a priestess is decent and pious. Heliogabalus thought that he would gain the respect of Rome and get divine babies from Aquilia, because there was something magical about the Vestals. However, Heliogabalus ended up badly. Such behavior was unacceptable for the Romans. His reign lasted only 4 years. Heliogabalus was stabbed to death, and his corpse was thrown into the Tiber River. Of course, the Vestals who occupied such an important position in society had their own detractors. So Tuccia had enemy too. When he could not accuse her of the extinction of the sacred fire, he decided on a more serious accusation. He collected false evidence and bribed slaves and accused her of losing her innocence and doomed our protagonist to a painful death. The urgently assembled court of pontiffs ordered our Vestal to defend herself. Tuccia understood that she had almost no chance to justify herself. But then she did something that no one had dared to do before. She asked her goddess for help. Tuccia said that she would prove her innocence. Our priestess turned to her goddess in despair. "Vesta, if I serve you with clean hands, make sure that these hands bring water to your temple from the Tiber in a sieve." And Vesta rescued her virgin. In front of the astonished Romans, Tuccia scooped up the water of the Tiber with a sieve and without spilling a drop carried it to the forum and poured it at the feet of the pontiffs. So Vesta justified her priestess in front of all Roman citizens. This story took place in 145 before Christ, as Plinius reported. And that person who accused the Vestal wasn't found, neither alive nor dead, despite an intensive search. Having performed a miracle, another Vestal, Claudia, was able to prove her innocence. She pulled the cable and moved the ship deeply stuck in the silt. However, not everyone was so lucky. Plinius the Younger was convinced that the Vestal Cornelia, accused of losing her innocence and buried alive by order of the Emperor Domitian, died for political reasons. He wrote, "As they brought her to the underground hall and her clothes got caught, she turned around and gathered them up. And when the executioner held out his hand to her, she stepped back and turned away with disgust, rejecting this bad conduct. She tried to die with decency and dignity." During the 1,000-year history of the Vestals, about 20 virgins were convicted for violating this found total. But what was waiting for the girls after their service? After 30 years, the Vestal received a pension and had a right to return to normal life and even get married. By the way, they were only 36, 40 years old and, as we remember, fabulously rich. There were many people who wanted to marry them. However, the priestesses themselves rarely married, because then a former priestess lost her high and unusual for a Roman woman position and became an ordinary matron, and from that moment she was completely dependent on her husband, to whom passed all her property. And the sacred priestesses of Vestal were not used to that. Vestal virgins preferred mostly to remain priestesses till the end of their life. So, our protagonist had been a priestess in the temple of Vesta all her life, keeping the sacred fire of the great goddess. In the later period of Roman history, the Vestals were closely associated with the cult of the emperor. Scientists suggest that in the 1st century AD, the vow of chastity was no longer held by the Vestals strictly, and the good emperors, Vespasian and Titus, overlooked it. Of course, intelligent, well-educated, and independent Vestals seemed to perceive their chastity as a relic of the past. However, the next emperor, Domitian, returned to the old order. Under him, 4 Vestals were convicted of violating the vow. Gradually, due to the Christianization of Rome, the Vestals lost their power and privileges. The Institute of Vestals existed until 391, when the Emperor Theodosius banned public pagan worship. After that, the sacred fire was extinguished, the Temple of Vesta was closed, and the Institute of Vestals was disbanded. By the way, without the protection of Vesta and her loyal priestesses, Roman Empire also didn't exist long. This was the beginning of its end. Less than 10 years later, the Goths plundered the Eternal City, and during the next century, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist. Do like and subscribe if you enjoyed this story. Oh, and click on the bell so you get notified when the new episode comes out.